Hello, friends, and welcome to the January 20th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues and how they can engage in the process here in the great state of Texas. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Outreach Director, and today's episode is being brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas. And this is a special edition because today is a holiday, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And so we are very excited to have one of our board members and professor at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminar, Asante Todd, with us today from a continent away. So Asante, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
No, it's good to be with you all today, Scott. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Looking forward to the conversation because you are somebody I just personally really wanted to talk to about this. So I hope you all enjoy the conversation, but I'm sure I will. So let's start out with just the legacy of Dr. King. What does that legacy mean to you?
The legacy of Dr. King is so interesting to me because it seems to be communicable to everyone, to a number of people, to a wide range of people. And again, King, I think, first of all, is such an interesting figure because he can have so many different meanings. I think we need to acknowledge that. For me, the legacy of King really centers around the Black freedom movement, and then expands out into the larger freedom movement for all of humanity. I think that's the legacy that King has left us with. He came to us with such passion, such conviction, and spoke prophetically to us about these things. And I think we still haven't really been able to let his words go, right? They still linger with us so many years after his death. In ways that many other figures during that time do not. And I think that that's for a reason, maybe for a few reasons. But to me, that's what the legacy of King means, that this general movement for freedom, not only for particularly oppressed peoples or groups, but freedom for everyone. This is what King ultimately was pushing. I think you can see that maybe one great example is near the end of King's life. 1968, the Memphis sanitation workers strike. King was showing a little bit of a change in direction in his thought and in his movements. He was up until that point focused on civil rights and integration, and he still held those beliefs dearly. He still valued those, but he also began to see and connect those concerns with concerns of workers and laborers. And so issues such as workers' rights, maybe even issues today that are prevalent, such as health care, right? Or health insurance for your job, right? All of these issues, I think, can be traced to be able to become not only out of King's movement, but coming out of King's thought and movement, especially near the end of his life. And for me, that's the legacy that King leaves for us.
So how should we as Texans in this modern context be thinking about King?
Again, King has so much to offer. I think for us in Texas, King maybe has a particularly relevant insight for what is happening in places like the Texas-Mexico border, right? Again, going back to this legacy of freedom and democracy and the ability to attain citizenship and not have that denied because of the color of one's skin or the geographic location that one comes from. Those convictions and ideals are still relevant and perhaps even more relevant today as we look at what's happening on the border. And I know the border is a controversial issue, and I think there are maybe some valid concerns on both sides, but I think there are some extremes beginning to happen whenever you begin to see kids separated from their families, right? Children without parents, persons detained in all sorts of less than ideal, shall we say, conditions, and conditions that, I would probably argue could be ultimately sanctioned by institutions or organizations like the UN or maybe even the federal government at certain points because of the violations of human rights that are occurring in these places. So I think King can speak a word of relevance to places like the Texas-Mexico border, where these same issues and questions are emerging again today about democracy, and citizenship and inclusion and who deserves it, right? And of course, King will remind us that we are all created in the image of God, and that the ethic that we, especially as believers, but not only as believers, should be living into is the ethic of love, right? Not only the ethic of love, the ethic of justice. And for King, love and justice, one of the things it meant was that people always were treated, got a fair chance, right? Got a fair shake. And, we know life is not fair all the time and things can't always go the way you want, but we do have the capability, we've done it, to run a fair democratic regime, right? And I think that's maybe another thing that King can say to us. Today we're seeing all sorts of threats to democracy, right? We have a governmental administration that is seeking to arrange things so that they can act unilaterally, right? Without the consent of the people, probably without the consent of Congress. And so, we get into questions or conversations about the Supreme Court, but all of this is pointing to the removal of the power from the people, right? And sending it up into the upper echelons of government. And that is something, again, that I think King can speak to us, remind us again today. King reminded us how the people can embody and embrace power in a very powerful, significant, yet nonviolent way. And I think that's also important to lift up. We got a lot of tensions and social conflicts going on, and there's a tendency to lean into violence. And I think King reminds us of the fruit of nonviolence. We often think it doesn't work, but guess what? It does, right? Because look at the situation. We just had a black president. I don't think we can ignore that legacy without King, right? And so I think we can acknowledge that legacy without King. And so I think King reminds us that even though nonviolence seems sometimes like it's not working, that it does have very efficacious and even long-term effects in ways that violence does not and never will be able to. So I think nonviolence is a big reminder for us. You want to say something, Scott?
Yeah, I'm interested. You started that answer by saying, I think this will be controversial, but. And one of the things I'm struck by is here we are in 2020, and I haven't looked up like what King would poll at today, but my guess is most people today would lift him up as a hero or an icon and all of those things. But my guess is his message today would still be very controversial, right? And so do you think have we watered down that message, lifted up the man, but watered down the message? What do you attribute that?
Oh man, that's you're trying to mess with me, yeah. I think maybe to a degree, we have forgotten a bit and watered down a bit the message of King. We probably listen to those parts of King that are more comfortable for us to hear, right? The emphasis maybe on love, integration, right? There have been tons of arguments to say that whenever you focus on only those aspects of King, you're really not getting a full picture of who this man and this figure was. I think we have maybe forgotten some of King's messages, and maybe even today, again, because given the governmental structures and the directions they're going, we may even be in a slightly less advantageous position than in the 1960s, when the question was not so much about democracy as it was about who is included in the democracy, right? And so today we've got both questions at play. Do we want a democracy, and who's included in this democracy or this political community if we do want a democracy? And so I think King is, again, going to remind us, if we want to play out this idea of equality of all people before God, it's hard to get away from democracy, right, as a political arrangement. It's really hard. And King also reminds us, again, with his turn, I think especially with his turn in 1968, of the ways in which even, I do believe America has made progress racially. I know this is a controversial statement. I think, you would have never seen the phenomenon of Barack Obama in the early 1900s. You'd have never seen it. In the 1800s, you'd have never seen it. And so I do think there's been progress. And I think that's something to be proud of and be inspired by. But I think because of that progress, we have lost sight of the direction that King was beginning to turn, right, towards the workers, towards the poor, towards those who perhaps couldn't find their way into the structures of power in society and were somehow on the suffering end of things. So King reminds us of those groups and those populations which actually are growing today. Again, you see what's happening at the Texas-Mexico border. Refugees, right, given wars, given conflicts, given different changes in the environment, people are moving around. People are needing different places to go. And so King's message, I think, is a great reminder to us that we need to be hospitable and we need to welcome persons. And that, guess what? We have far more resources than we know what to do with. We have far more resources. King, even in the 1960s, and I think this is exactly true, King says we actually have the technological capability to feed the world, but we lack the moral will. And I think that same message is relevant today. We've got water issues in Flint. We've got environmental issues, but at the same time, you see these things being marketized in ways that are inaccessible to certain people, right? There's nothing wrong with the market intrinsically, but we need to be mindful of the ways that it affects poor persons and persons that are excluded and on the margins.
So one of the things I've been talking about the last couple of weeks is that 2020 is going to be a really long year in terms of just a lot of things going on this year that people are going to need to be engaged on, and we're going to be asking people to push themselves to engage civically. But there are a lot of people who are stressed. There are a lot of people who are hurting. What do you find that gives you hope during this time?
I'll start off by saying hope is always, hope can be a fickle friend. It can be tied into our emotions and the daily events of our lives and things like this. And I know people get hope from all sorts of different places. For me, the hope is in moments like that you see with persons like King, right? And not just, sort of the big celebrity images that are all over the media, TV, and that kind of thing. But what happened with King and his movement for freedom for all people is happening on a daily basis in all these little ways with people that we never hear about. And for me, that's what gives me hope, is that the day-to-day, everyday person still has these convictions that democracy and freedom for all is what this country should be, and that this in some way is reflective of the faith that we've embraced. And so for me, that's what gives me hope, because if you were to look at the situation of segregation in the 1950s, you'd have never thought it was imaginable that this system could be overthrown in the next decade. And I've had the privilege of speaking with persons who were part of those movements and maybe even on both sides of the movements during that time, and they all say the same thing. We didn't think this thing was possible. We didn't know how it was possible. And so King, and I believe under the power of the Holy Spirit, I know this is get into this conversation, but I believe that King shows us that the things we think are not possible are possible if we're committed and willing to make some sacrifices for these things. I think for me that's the inspiring thing. And again, this is not just King. I'm over in South Africa as we speak. I'm teaching a 2-week travel seminar where we're visiting cities like Johannesburg, Cape Town, Stellenbosch. And so we're also seeing a similar history here, right? With South Africa had the system of apartheid that was overthrown. And so we've looked at figures like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, right? And the powerful ways in which they have impacted the culture, so that, perhaps South Africa is not exactly where it should be, as the U.S. is not where it should be, but it's not where it was, right? It has overthrown and overcome the system of apartheid, and has established institutions not only to implement democracy, but to remember the ills so that they don't revisit them. And so even the things I've seen over here today have inspired me. very hopeful. And also, I think one thing I was reminded of while I'm here in Africa is that, and this is also the case with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King near the end of his life. King always believed that all people were equal before God, and King always believed in integration. But near the end of his life, King believed that all of us, white, black, whoever, needed to take a closer look at African cultures and other cultures that had perhaps a different way and perspective on the world, and on nature, and on reality. And so I'm wondering, not to have a romantic view of cultures beyond the West, but I wonder if some cultures beyond the West maybe have a different way of reading nature that we need to listen to, right? It's no secret that the U.S. has primarily operated over the course of its centuries out of a utilitarian ethic, right? You use nature for what you need it for, and you discard it after that. And we're beginning to see the effects of that. Even with this current administration, we're beginning to see effects towards being negligent to the environment. And I think cultures in places like Africa will probably have a different reading on the world and nature, so that it's not the kind of world that we can just pick up, use, and discard, but that we have to give it reverence, we have to honor it, understand that it's its own entity, and that, guess what? We are dependents. We're dependents on the world. We need the world. We need the world's resources. And so I think that's an important message for us to begin to listen to as we look at issues like water shortages, climate change and global warming, right? All these environmental, what's happening in the Amazon, right? All these questions are begging us to take a different approach to how we look at nature itself, and to make really something of a paradigm shift. I think if King had stayed with us a bit longer, that's where he would have pushed us to a fundamental paradigm shift, so that we're still a culture with problems. We're still a culture with certain ills, but we're not doing things as bad as we perhaps, we're not mistreating the environment as badly as we once was. So I think for me, that's what's on my mind today when we talk about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yes,
perspective on the world. Yeah.
So is there anything else you would hope our folks would do moving forward after this MLK Day celebration and weekend?
Yeah, I'll say, I think that in most of my conversations with folks, I think the number one concern that I hear is that people feel simply overwhelmed. Right? There's so much going on. There's so many issues. There are issues of women's rights, of gender, of environment, of race. Now, in a way, not to reduce them all, but I think they're all connected in a certain way. Maybe one way is that they're all sort of the negative image of this thing, this nebulous thing that we call whiteness, right? Whatever that means, right? This identity marker that really, if you look deep into it, is kind of dissolved of content, of cultural content, as opposed to invested with it. I think people are so overwhelmed that what I would say is start with one thing that you are passionate about, and that is doable and winnable. Start with one thing that you are passionate about that is doable and winnable, and go from there, right? Really, again, like I said, we look at King in the 1960s, and he was a leader and a figure, but he wasn't the only one doing this work, and his work would not have been possible without the everyday people who had already set the ground stage for him, right? Who already prepared things for him and even carried on the torch after. And so don't underestimate your significance, is what I'd say. And to find one thing that's doable and winnable and go from there that you are passionate about. And I think you will have a bit of success and feel a bit more empowered in terms of your social involvement.
That'll preach, Dr. Todd. You should maybe think about doing it professionally.
Well, I'm praying about it. Pray for me. I'm still thinking about it.
All right.
Maybe one more thing, if I may. Maybe I'll say one more thing. I think we should also be reminded, and King brings this directly to us. This is nothing, though, that we don't know. King was always adamant that he was moved out of a sense of who he believed God was. Again, King believed God was a God of love and justice, not a God of arbitrary power. And so I think that we need to remember that, even our own faith commitments, that God's laws God's ultimate law is love. And that love establishes a standard of justice that excludes arbitrary operations of power, right? Abuses of power. And so I think that's an important message for us to remember. And again, even as we're reading these different dimensions of culture and society, where are these problematic and arbitrary acts of power? And where does that stand in relationship to our theological commitments?
All right. Appreciate that. Anything, I always like to give folks a chance to shamelessly plug. Anything you'd like to shamelessly plug today?
Oh, I'm always up for a shameless plug. So, you may have made a mistake. But no, thank you. Maybe one thing I'll say is, the main thing I'll say is I'm actually working on a book on this right now, and I don't have a release date or this kind of thing, but I am working on a manuscript that really is asking the question of how we might engage the world differently, predicated on theological beliefs such as King's, right? How might we read nature and reality different? And what are the implications of that for things like economy? What are the implications of things like that for politics? And how do we, as those who are faithful Christians who also believe in the freedom of all peoples and democratic society, go about living out this life? And so I hope to finish that book sometime I hope to finish it tomorrow, but that's not going to happen. More realistically, it'll be done sometime early summer to midsummer. And I'm working with publishers and hopefully be released near the end of this year. But if there's one shameless plug I would lift up, it'll be that.
You'll come back on when that book is released, right?
Yes, I would love to if you'll have me.
All right. Well, I've got a commitment. Y'all can write that down. We'll try to get you back on to push some books for you.
Yeah.
All right. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I just want to say thank you for the conversation. And thank you for the opportunity to talk a bit about this thing that I think is really important. I think others think is also matters a lot. And I also want to thank the folks listening out there who care about this and understand that we're living in interesting times and we need to sort of be on our P's and Q's when it comes to the treatment of our democratic society and the persons within. So,
yeah, I also thank you for the time. This has been good for my soul and good for me being able to celebrate this holiday correctly. Right. So thank you for the conversation. And thanks for all you do. I know you're traveling right now, and so this wasn't easy for you. So I appreciate the time and for the work you're doing.
Not a problem. Yeah.
And like Asante, I thank you all for tuning in today. We'll continue these weekly witness conversations throughout 2020. If you have ideas for who you'd like to hear from or what you'd like to hear about, please let me know. You can reach out to me at scott@texasimpact.org. Keep an eye on our website, texasimpact.org, and our social media for ways that you can get involved. I know we have a refugee sign-on letter that's live right now. We're encouraging you and your congregations to sign on to that. We also have events coming up, United Methodist Women's Legislative event, January 26th through 28th, and the Interfaith Advocacy Day, the Interfaith Advocacy Conference, February 16th through 18th. So make sure to sign up for both of those on the website. It is going to be a busy year. Take care of yourself. Take care of your friends. Until we see you next week, let's get to work.